Greetings, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our weekend celebration of the life and work of Ann and Sasha Shulgin. My name is Peter Maravellis, and I'm the events director at City Lights. On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers, I'd like to welcome you to session 3 of our celebration. It's titled Currents in Psychedelic Research and Regulation. This event is being presented by City Lights in conjunction with Transform Press and Synergetic Press as we inaugurate the release of their new book titled The Nature of Drugs, History, Pharmacology, and Social Impact, Volume 1. This is the first in 2 volumes of the writings based on the lectures of the late Alexander Sasha Shulgin, recorded at San Francisco State University in the late 80s. Intended to be taught as an introductory course on drugs and biochemistry, this transcription is a unique document, being both an historical record of Alexander Shulgin's teaching style and the culmination of his philosophy on drugs, psychopharmacology, states of consciousness, and societal and individual freedoms related to the use of psychoactive substances. As we begin this session, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being broadcast from the site of the ancestral homelands of the Mwekma Ohlone peoples. On this peninsula, 8 different dialects of the Mwekma Ohlone language were once spoken. It is with respect to those who came before us that I would like to begin our proceedings and offer a moment of silence to stand in recognition of the place that we occupy. A special thanks goes out to our co-sponsors of this weekend sessions. They are organizations that are at the forefront of pharmacological advocacy and research. A spirited thanks to the Beckley Foundation, California Institute of Integral Studies, the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, the Arrowwood Center, Fireside Project, Lucid News, the McKenna Academy, MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, the Psychedelic Sangha, Psychedelic Society of San Francisco and the UK, Psychedelic Seminars, Psychedelics Today, the Usona Institute, and the City Lights Foundation, which is continuing the legacy of our late founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, into the future. This program could not have been realized without the collective efforts of a lot of people. It would be difficult to really list them all, but first and foremost, a huge debt goes out to Transform Press and Synergetic Press. I would like to pay our respects to Ann Shulgin and Wendy Tucker for really carrying on an important legacy. They're the keepers of a repository of really priceless data. This collaboration with Synergetic Press continues their commitment to the research conducted by Ann and Sasha and the mentorship they offered to many gifted researchers that continue this important work. A huge thank you is also due to Deborah Parrish-Snyder, the co-owner and publisher of Synergetic Press. Synergetic Press is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and for over 30 years has been publishing unique and paradigm-shifting books on the environment, ethnobotany, psychedelics, consciousness and cultural anthropology, and much more. Their collaborations with Transform Press is an excellent example of the rich and important projects that they continue to pursue. City Lights is honored to be working with them once again, and we've collaborated on numerous events that have included like work with Ralph Metzner, tributes to Albert Hoffman, and much, much more. So it's great to be in their orbit. We sent out a special thanks to Sandy Balin, Doug Rell, and Jasmine Virda at Synergetic. Also to Amanda Muller, who had the crucial role to play in the production of The Nature of Drugs. The book itself is such a gorgeous artifact. It's beautifully produced and really most fitting for the content that it represents. So before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of The Nature of Drugs. We are also taking orders for P-Call and T-Call, the 2 great formularies and magnum opuses of Ann and Sasha Shulgin's work. Secondly, I'd like to let you know about a real treat that our friends at Ovazo Conferencing have prepared for us. It is a virtual environment based upon a hill located on the property next to the Shulgin's laboratory. Up to 40 people at a time may meet in this environment. So it's a kind of a virtual hill. And within this hill is a facsimile of the Shulgin laboratory that you can access. So you'll need to actually familiarize yourself with the Ozo platform. You'll also need to use Google Chrome to access the site. We're going to be posting links in the chat function that kind of give you, directions on how to, what you need to do to access it. So you will have 2 opportunities today. One will be after this session, and then another in the kind of interim between the last session and the one before. So finally, you may post questions and comments for our speakers in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. There's going to be a Q&A at the end of the panel, so please feel free to post. Our moderator for the session will be Hamilton Morris. Hamilton Morris is a chemist, filmmaker, and science journalist. A graduate of the New School, Hamilton Morris conducts chemistry research at the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia. He is a writer and director of the documentary series Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, where he explores the chemistry and traditions surrounding psychoactive drugs. He's also the author of a book on Bufo alvarius, where the proceeds have gone to raise more than $160,000 for Parkinson's disease research. Joining him today will be Dr. Nickolas Cozzi. Dr. Cozzi is a scientist and educator at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and co-founder of the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute, where he is president and director of pharmacology. Dr. Cozzi's research involves the design, chemical synthesis, and testing of substances with central nervous system activity. He is interested in how these agents act on the brain to enhance mood, improve cognition, and increase awareness, and in their clinical value for treating addiction, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic fear, and other mental ailments. I'm going to take a moment now. I want to let a few people in before we continue these bios, because we do have quite a few people waiting. There we go. Joining us next will be Dr. Paul Daley. Dr. Daley is a student of Sasha Shulgin's. He has over 40 years of experience in analytical toxicology, entomology, and environmental sciences. He has over 60 publications in integrated pest management, plant photosynthesis, environmental chemistry, and much, much more. He was a career scientist at the Lawrence Livermore Lab from 1984 through 2014. He is the chief science officer and chemist at the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute, where his work focuses on the chemistry and pharmacology of psychoactive and psychedelic drugs. He co-authored the Shulgin Index, which was published by Transform Press in 2011. And also joining our panel will be two representatives from MAPS, Rick Doblin and John Gilmore. Dr. Rick Doblin is the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He has been one of the nation's leading proponents for the study and legalization of psychedelic research and therapy. He has studied with Dr. Stanislav Grof and was among the first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. He has been working to help to develop legal context for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth and otherwise healthy people. He makes his home in Boston, Massachusetts. John Gilmore is a board member of MAPS. He is also on the boards of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Marijuana Policy Project. He was an early employee of Sun Microsystems, an early free software and open source author, and created Cygnus Solutions, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and Cypherpunks, the DES Cracker, and the Usenet's alt newsgroups. He spent 40 years doing programming, hardware and software design, management advocacy, philosophy, philanthropy, and investment, focusing on getting people to think more about the society they're building. Also with us are Amanda and Cosmo Feilding. Amanda Feilding is the founder and executive director of the Beckley Foundation and is widely recognized as a leading force behind the current psychedelic renaissance. By establishing key research programs at some of the world's most prestigious institutions, including the Imperial College in London, Maastricht University, Sant Pau in Barcelona, and many other places. She has propelled the field forward over the last 20 years, conducting landmark studies, such as the world's first psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, which was a really landmark study, the world's first LSD, MDMA, and DMT brain imaging studies, plus the initiation and collaboration with Johns Hopkins on the first study using psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy and overcome nicotine addiction. She has also co-authored over 80 research papers. Cosmo Feilding Mellon is a drug development entrepreneur dedicated to unlocking the medical potential of psychoactive substances such as cannabis and psychedelics in order to help patients in need. He is a founder and CEO of Beckley SciTech, a private company established in 2019 to address neurological and psychiatric disorders through psychedelic medicine. He has worked closely with the Beckley Foundation for over 10 years, and in 2016, he co-founded Beckley Research Innovations to develop ethical business models built around promising scientific research into medical cannabis and psychedelics. Also joining us is Leonard Pickard. Mr. Pickard is a former drug policy fellow at the Kennedy School of Government, research associate in neurobiology at Harvard Medical School, and deputy director of the Drug Policy Analysis Program at UCLA. His 1996 evidence-based prediction of the fentanyl epidemic and recommendations for prevention were featured in the RAND Corporation's 2019 The Future of Fentanyl and Other Synthetic Opioids. So please welcome now Hamilton Morris to moderate this session.
Thank you. Wow. And this truly is an extraordinary panel. I mean, I could spend this 2-hour session talking to any one of you, and I'm so delighted that this is happening and for such a wonderful cause. This book, The Nature of Drugs, is something that I've heard quite a few people say the same thing, that it feels like you are hearing Sasha's voice. This is a literal transcript of him teaching a class, and his personality, his brilliance, his expertise come across so powerfully in this text. But for the people that didn't have the great pleasure of knowing Sasha and spending time with him, I would love to hear from each of the panelists about your relationship with him, something that he taught you, something that was an experience that you think would allow other people to understand the sort of man Sasha Shulgin was. And I will begin with John Gilmore.
Hi. Let's see. I started doing drug policy in 2000, and somewhere along the way I met Sasha. John Hanna organized the Mind States conferences, and I ran into him at several of those, and one of them was kind of memorable. It was in 2007 when Sasha was teaching sort of his classic dirty pictures seminar where he'd draw molecules on the board and say, and I tried this one and this was amazing. And so I took off the methyl group and I put on an ethyl group and I made this other one. He talked about the first 4 or 5 drugs that he had synthesized. Mescaline was the thing that got him interested. And one of the first ones he made was escalin. And he put up the characteristics on the board that said, oh, 40 to 60 milligrams. It's about 5 times as powerful as mescaline. And this sort of threw me back to a time in the 1980s when a friend had given me a little vial of powder marked escalin. I thought just like the M had come off on the paper label or something. And they said, oh, this is synthetic mescaline. Well, I took it and I had an extraordinary experience. Took me right out of my body. My friends took me through a hospital. I ended up 100 miles away in my own bed when I woke up the next day. Anyway, so after the class, I told Sasha about this. And I said, I noticed that this escalin is like 5 times, 1/5 the dosage of mescaline. And he said, I think you probably have had the largest known human dose of escalin. Will you, send me a trip report? So that was one of my introductions to Sasha.
That's great. And Cosmo?
Yeah, well, I suppose Sasha was, through my mother, Amanda, kind of almost like a kind of grandparent to me. So I was kind of lucky enough. We all, well, with a few other people on the panel, we all went to Burning Man together a few times when I was about 19, 20 kind of thing. And we all traveled up together and camped together. And I just thought, Sasha was this very kind of lovely old man. And then you suddenly get to Burning Man and you realize there are kind of queues of people waiting to meet him, to kind of meet the great master. And he was just the most humble, incredible man. And I just remember a few kind of anecdotes from the years that we were doing that together, where I remember one year on a morning, Sasha and Ann coming out in the morning going, I got news for you, kiddo. There's great sex after 80, which is very cool. And then we went to Reno once and went on the way back or the way there, I can't remember, and went to a casino. And it turned out that Sasha could actually count cards. So he went to play blackjack and completely cleared out because he was so good at counting cards. So he was just a kind of incredibly humble and understated genius, basically.
And Rick?
Yeah, well, I got to know Sasha in 1984 when we started having meetings at Esalen to try to prepare for the inevitable crackdown that we knew was going to come against MDMA because it had been used in public settings as ecstasy. And I just was so amazed to learn about all the other substances that Sasha had developed and what he had done to bring MDMA back to the fore and to give it to Leo Zeff, to introduce it into therapeutic settings. So it was just really wonderful to be planning with Sasha and others about how to protect this, wonderful, wonderful medicine. But the memory that I'd like to share was in 1992. So MDMA was criminalized initially by DEA in 85. And, we had a DEA administrative law judge hearings to try to keep it in Schedule 3. And the administrative law judge actually agreed with us that it should be in Schedule 3, but the administrator of the DEA rejected that recommendation and kept it in Schedule 1. Eliminating therapeutic use. And that's where it was clear that the only way to bring it forward was through the FDA. So that's where I started MAPS in 86. And we had 5 different protocols from Harvard, from UC San Francisco, elsewhere, all rejected by the FDA. And then with Charlie Grob, we had a protocol for MDMA for cancer patients with anxiety. And in 1990, the FDA had approved Rick Strassman to do DMT research. So that was the first little opening. And then the people at the FDA decided that they needed to have a special advisory committee meeting to decide whether to open the door to psychedelic research. And prior to that meeting, 2 days before, the immediate 2 days before, the National Institute on Drug Abuse organized an expert committee on all of their animal researchers who had done work with different psychedelics for them to decide whether they wanted to open the door to psychedelics. And Sasha was part of those meetings, even though he was the animals he was working with were humans, particularly himself. And so in the room was people from the DEA, people from the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, people from NIDA, that was the drug czar's office, and there was one moment where it was Sasha's turn to make a presentation. And with all of these police enforcers in the room and prohibitionists, Sasha gave this incredible talk on structure-activity relationships and how he would try to develop drugs, what new modifications he would make to the molecules, and then how he would predict, or guess what that actually would do, and then how he would actually take the medicines themselves to find out for sure what they actually did. And as he was going through this was just an incredible amount of information that he was presenting, but it was also clear that he was doing this at some personal risk, because this was the analog bill had passed that would criminalize drugs that were substantially similar to other drugs that were illegal. And it was clear that a lot of these drugs that Sasha was talking about were similar to MDMA, similar to other illegal drugs. And so he was kind of crossing this line. He wasn't going through FDA permission. He wasn't doing animal studies beforehand to demonstrate that they were safe enough. He was just doing it himself. And so there was this sense in the room that Sasha was exposing himself to a personal degree of risk. But what he was sharing was so fascinating to all the people there, this whole question about these structure-activity relationships, that they let him continue. And that was a 2-day meeting. My sense of it was that this was like a galvanizing moment meeting. And people recognized that this sort of human research that Sasha was reporting on was essential. And so the other animal researchers that were funded by NIDA were saying that unless they can do human research to compare to their animal data, the animal data was going to become increasingly irrelevant, because unless you know what it means in the animals and then you correlate whatever happens in humans, I'm not quite sure what it means. So what I saw was this. Oh, sorry for this echo. I'm not sure. But what I saw happening was that this courage that Sasha demonstrated to put himself on the line and to really sort of demonstrate why human research was so necessary, that the NIDA researchers at the end of the meeting sort of came around together and they endorsed the idea that there needed to be human research. And so the next FDA, the next day, which was the FDA meeting, the advisory committee, it opened up with a report from NIDA saying that the NIDA funded researchers recommended the resumption of human research. And then at the end of the day, the FDA advisory committee followed suit and recommended the resumption of human research. And that, I see, was the critical moment in this psychedelic renaissance that we're in right now. It was the FDA willing to say, yes, they would open the door to human research. And it was the courage of Sasha that really helped that take place. And so that was just this yet another example of Sasha, the classic story of telling truth to power. And he did it in such a disarming way, without a sense of guilt, but just how important it was. And so I always admired Sasha for that, and really looked at the way in which he was willing to share information with everybody without a sense of sort of vulnerability, even though he was vulnerable. So it really spoke to Sasha's courage. And it was just amazing to see how he could galvanize this. And so in many ways, Sasha really brought forth MDMA, which revitalized the psychedelic therapeutic community. And then he galvanized the NIDA researchers and the FDA to open the door to psychedelic research. So it was just yet another example of Sasha's courage and his leadership.
Yeah, yeah. And Leonard, do you have any memories you'd like to share?
Well, yes, Hamilton, maybe too many. You'll have to kind of cut me off, I think. Wonderful to see so many dear friends, old friends here to honor this bright spirit that was Sasha. Everyone has their heroes, and Sasha was mine. I recall first becoming aware of him at Mallinckrodt Laboratories, the old Mallinckrodt building here in Cambridge, perusing a copy of the Journal of Organic Chemistry. And there was Sasha's, one of his early papers with Peyton Jacobs. And I became entranced with his work, of course, as so many did. And thereafter read every paper for the next 40 years. I was down at Stanford in the mid 80s, and I had come in from the far deserts alone for some years, doing unusual things, and had a problem with the synthesis of mescaline, a technical problem, and insurmountable technical problem. And decided the only man one could talk to, because there were so few elders in those days one could talk to, was Sasha. So I wrote a letter, and rather promptly an invitation came back to visit Sasha's class in toxicology, if you will, at San Francisco State. So I appeared, and there was Ann, as always, attending the lectures rather devotedly with her notepad, and Wendy, the daughter with her long mane of golden hair. She just arrived from Japan or India or the Levant. And the class was quite gleeful to see Sasha. I recall going through that entire set of lectures with a bright smile on my face, just listening to his beautiful delivery. One could tell he loved the art of chemistry. He saw the magic. He felt the heart of the science. From there, I was privileged in this particular collection of Sasha's transcribed lectures to actually sit through all of the lectures in the book. And so it was a great privilege reading this wonderful publication by City Lights and Transform and Synergy to re-evoke the memory of Sasha in these lectures. But you wanted anecdotes. So I once proposed to Sasha in the beautiful lab that Paul Daley is occupying now, that Sasha, why are you spending months and months doing bench work to synthesize a single compound when right down the hill at Berkeley, there are combinatorial chemists that are doing thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of machine-driven variants very quickly, and one could zip through all of these analogs. And he said, one would miss all the fun. So Sasha loved to think about molecules and rotate the enantiomers and stereoisomers in his head and play with the molecules and just imagine what the synthesis would produce, what structure would produce what activity. I can recall sitting on a moonlit night with Sasha and Ann before Pickard, in which he brought out his handwritten notebooks, voluminous notebooks of syntheses he's done year after year. And with great delight, he presented these, and I flipped through them in the moonlight, and synthesis after synthesis, alpha-1 and 5-methoxy this and 1-nitro that. And I teased him by going, "Where's the eureka?" Well, Sasha did have his favorite compounds. Perhaps the thing that sticks with me most is just the nature of the man. You know, he was quite tall. I'm tall, but I had to reach up to hug Sasha. He always greeted visitors, as did Ann, with a great bear hug and a great mane of white hair. And he spoke rapidly and softly. And in his laboratory, he would twinkle, and watching his hands move, doing a few hundred milligrams of some exotic substance in thin layer chromatography. His hand moved quickly and delicately and accurately like a surgeon, as though he greatly loved and respected the art, the science, the molecule, the outcome of it in the hearts of men and women worldwide. He knew what he was doing, and he honored it, as we today honor him. But one fun anecdote, cut me off, Hamilton, if you wish. Rick organized a meeting at Harvard Medical School in 96 or so, and Sasha was the invitee for the lunch talk. And he was surrounded by these great clusters of eminent neuroscientists. And there's Sasha with his slideshow and structure activity. But what everybody enjoyed the most and what broke the room up was Sasha's recollection of his freshman year at Harvard, which he was in the yard. All freshmen live in the yard and in elegant dormitories with names like Pennypacker and Wigglesworth. And there's Sasha describing his freshman chemistry experiment, which kind of blew out a window in the yard. A great boom resounded across the yard, purposely for entertaining the freshmen, to which he was called to task by the administration and pled forgiveness and eventually was forgiven. But this great man was encountered by all of us, many of us, me personally, in diverse areas of the world. You could not miss Sasha in meetings, the early meetings. I saw him in Heidelberg and London and Cambridge, San Francisco, Berkeley, Esalen, Palm Beach. There was always Sasha, a foot above the crowd, and chatting away and saying hello and embracing people. A great spirit moving among us.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And Paul, who is currently in Sasha's laboratory, do you have any memories? I know that you have many
Yeah, gosh, it's true. It's kind of hard to winnow through all of the thoughts that I have about Sasha. Um, I guess I'd start with the moment that I met him. Uh, I was freshly installed, starting my doctoral work at Berkeley, and in the Berkeley Barb, that lovely, notorious counterculture newspaper. I ran into an ad for the Second International Conference on Hallucinogenic Mushrooms. Well, let's see, that was 1977. So I had, without knowing anything about the source or authorship, I had picked up the Magic Mushroom Growers Guide by Austin Eric. I think that's been pretty well exposed by now. So I've been growing magic mushrooms for a couple of years. I'd actually had an internship working on tryptamines in phalaris grass. And it was there in 1972 that I first ran into the ethnopharmacologic search for psychoactive drugs, which was sitting on the bookshelf of the lab where I was working. And that and his 69 paper in Nature on the structure activity relationships of the one ring psychotomimetics was my first introduction to Shulgin, although, it sort of stuck, but, I had never met him. I didn't really know, who this person was. But when I saw that ad in the Barb, at first I thought, well, I'm here at Berkeley to follow a button down commercial agriculture oriented degree program, basically in population ecology and environmental physiology. And what would my advisors think if I took off to a hallucinogens conference? So I kind of tucked it away and thought, well, I can't do that. And then I saw the same ad show up about 2 weeks later, and listing that Albert Hoffman and Gordon Wasson and Richard Evans Schultes were going to be speaking. I thought, these are the giants of a field that I would have loved to pursue, but with the advent of the war on drugs under Nixon, there didn't seem to be any possibility that a young person could enter that field. So I thought, well, there's no way I can't be at that meeting. So I'd gotten my Ford Mustang, drove up there to Washington State, got myself installed, and at the first wine social, the first three people I walked up to were Andrew Weil. Had a nice animated conversation with him. I had just read The Natural Mind. I was very impressed with his thoughts there. And then the second person was Sasha, and as Leonard points out, he's a very striking figure. This tall, slender gentleman with a big shock of white hair and toothy grin. And so he said, and why are you here? And I said, well, I'm an entomology student, and but I've been interested in psychedelics for quite a long time and done some work on tryptamines and phalaris. And oh, well, maybe you could tell me about this. And I've seen that reaction from Sasha to many, many people. He all but immediately would embrace a new face, a new brain, and would want to find out everything he could about what brought that person into his presence. And I loved that then. And as we got closer, I kind of cycled away from the Bay Area for quite a while, and then got hired on at the Lawrence Livermore Lab, which is a very drug-averse environment, and really didn't think I'd ever run into him again. I did at Macworld back in the day when we had computer expos, and he was always kind of in the back of my mind. Then in 1993, I think we'd had a conversation on the phone. He sent me a copy of Pickard, the lovely inscription, saying, this will kind of catch you up on what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And I recall very vividly being at one of my kids' soccer games. So my 3 and 6 year old are out playing soccer while I'm opening up Pickard. I got to book 2, and my reaction was, oh shit, Sasha, what have you done? And as we all know, he kind of laid out a huge block of work that had really been largely not published out in the scientific literature at that point, but wrapped in this lovely story of the fictional Shura and Alice, and how they came to share their interests, and the interest became love. And anyway, it was very inspiring. So a little while after that, I started hanging around with them. I think starting out with innocent things like fixing his computer. There were always a stream of young guys who would love to come and sit with Sasha and chat chemistry. And somehow I thought, well, that's not what I'm really here for. I'm more interested in just getting to know this fellow, because he's such a fascinating character. You know, we talk about his, impact on chemistry and pharmacology. People forget that he was, sort of a semi-professional musician. He was in the Bohemian Grove Orchestra for 50 years. So we don't hear his stories about that so much. I loved a couple of his jokes. He would always say, you know why he was a viola player. I guess viola was, you could always get a seat as a violist, and yet there were always too many people competing for the violinist chairs. He said, you know why a viola is so much more valuable than a violin? No, it takes longer to burn. And then the other one that I like is, he said, you know why a bull and an orchestra are the opposite of one another? No. He says, well, with a bull, the horns are in the front and the asshole's in the back. Sasha had this kind of devilish sense of humor, and we just loved to hear it. It came out like at most unexpected times, and but pretty consistently, and it was just delightful. So I think with that, I'll close for now. It was a joy being around him. It was like a real pleasure of my life.
Thank you. And Nick Cozzi, I've never had the pleasure of speaking with you previously, but I've followed your work for many years. Do you have a memory you'd like to share?
Yeah, thank you, Hamilton, and thanks for City Lights and everyone for putting this on. But my memory would be this. I met Sasha in the mid-1980s when I was still a student in the School of Pharmacy, and I'd had an interest in science since I was a little boy, and in psychedelics since I was a teenager growing up in the 60s. And I wanted somehow to be able to combine these interests, science and psychedelics. It wasn't clear to me that there was a path forward, because at that time, of course, there was quite a bit of stigma associated with these materials, and it wasn't clear to me how I would be able to combine these. But in the mid 80s, I joined the American Chemical Society as kind of a first step towards kind of professionalism. And I joined the Division of Medicinal Chemistry as my chosen division. And so at the time we got, paper hard copies of journals sent to us. And the first copy that I got was, I recall it was July, I think it was 1985. And I'm paging through it, and I come across this article, and it's called Psychotomimetic N-methyl N-isopropyl Tryptamines, Effects of Variation of Aromatic Oxygen Substituents. And the authors were David Repke, Doug Grotjan, and Sasha Shulgin. And so I read this, just with great interest. And I was fascinated by the chemistry. I mean, it was hardcore, rigorous science, and so this was something I was seeking. But at the end, and in the experimental section, they describe how they tasted these compounds and determined effective doses in humans. And he talked about the double conscious technique of Gordon Alice, and the subjects that tested this. I guess there were 5, ranging in age from 26 to 62. I kind of figured he was the old guy, so I'm assuming he was 62, but maybe he wasn't. But so this was the answer I'd been seeking. It was in the Journal of Medicinal Chemistry, certainly no slouch of a journal, very rigorous, and yet it was exploring this area I had great interest in. So I thought I got to talk to this guy at some point, and so I did. Eventually, I called him up on the phone. I had actually set up a laboratory in the basement of my house, and was exploring compounds such as MDMA and 2CB and 2CI and other compounds. And none of these were scheduled substances at the time. And the Analogs Act wasn't enacted until 1986. So this is, I fell into this like legal research area, but kind of self-directed. And I called him on the phone. I recall it was between Christmas and New Year's, and described my work with 2CB, and he was very generous with his time. I mean, he was approachable, and I mean, he was some person calling him out of the blue, and certainly still an undergraduate at the time. So I was very impressed with his kind of courtesy and respect that he was showing me for a person who was interested in this area. He sent me some write-ups on 2CB. I'm not sure who wrote the write-up, but what stands out in my mind was that 16 milligrams was what they called a museum dose, and where you could take it and like go walk around a museum and enjoy the artwork and stuff. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But at any rate, so he was kind of a North Star for me career-wise. He had shown a way that I could realize what I was interested in, but in a rigorous scientific way. We eventually met. He encouraged me to finish my studies in the School of Pharmacy, encouraged me to go to graduate school, and so on. And so over the years, we became, friends as much as you can be. I live in Wisconsin, he's out in the Bay Area, and for somebody that you only see occasionally, and at the time, I mean, this is like, before the internet and stuff, so letters are all handwritten and so on. So that was a little bit of a damper, but eventually we got to collaborate in doing some scientific work and some publications and so on. And so that was, kind of how he helped shape my career, and to this day, I continue in that area. And then just another little tidbit was, and this will kind of bring Rick Doblin, Paul Daley, myself, and Sasha together. I was in North Carolina, a professor at the Brody School of Medicine in the early 2000s. And Rick, somebody had contacted Rick, I guess it was the producers from Unsolved History, and they wanted to do a piece on the Salem witch trials. And there was some hypothesis that the events in Salem in the 1600s, 1619 or whatever it was, might have been induced by sort of a mass hysteria, or not a mass hysteria, but actually a mass ergotism outbreak. And so the Unsolved History folks wanted to find out, is this possible? Could that happen? Is there some sort of experiment we could do? And so so this is thanks to Rick that I met these folks. And then we came up with the hypothesis, or the observation, that it's known that ergot alkaloids are quite sensitive to both heat and light, but in particular heat. So the question arose, well, if there was ergot contaminating the rye that they were using to make their bread, wouldn't simply baking the bread in the oven destroy the ergot alkaloids and therefore render them inert? And so was like, oh, well, we could do an experiment. We could, get some ergot from somewhere. I didn't know where, and bake it. And, we could do this in my lab in North Carolina. And there are tests for ergot alkaloids, kind of simple tests one could do. So I was out for I guess it was a Mind States conference in the early 2000s, and was talking to Sasha about this like, where can I find some ergot? And he kind of looked at Ann, and then he looked and he said, Paul Daley. And it was like, oh, well, I don't know who this person is. Oh, we've got to introduce you to Paul Daley. And so that was my introduction to Paul. And yeah, sure enough, he had a bunch of ergot that he was willing to share with me, like the actual, the Mutterkorns, I guess they're called. And so he gave me
it looks like Paul's got them right there.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, right. It's probably, yeah, you got, well, that's a ton of them there. So Paul sent me on my merry way back to North Carolina with some samples of ergot heads. And so I ground these up, and we bought some rye flour at the grocery store and mixed the ergot in. And really the simplest way to do this was to like bake the bread and then dry it out in an oven after, like not only bake it, but then make it so we drove off all the water, and then, crumbled it, ground up all the flour, extracted the flour, and then just ran a TLC plate. And, the ergot alkaloids fluoresce under ultraviolet light. And incidentally, I also purchased a sample of ergotamine tartrate from Sigma Aldrich as kind of a positive control. So we put some ergotamine into the rye as well. I was trying to be a good scientist here, and so lo and behold, sure enough, the ergot alkaloids survived the baking process. And so they had, there's an unsolved history from back around that time that investigates this. And I think, I owe a debt of gratitude to Sasha for putting me together with Paul, and kind of permitting this event to happen. But not only that, but Paul and I became fast friends like immediately. It's like we felt like we knew each other for years and years and years. And we've maintained a very close friendship and scientific relationship also as collaborators since like 2003 or something like that. And so that's another debt of gratitude I owe Sasha for putting me together with Paul, who I love dearly as a friend, and admire his scientific chops as well. So I'll end there, and it just warms my heart to think about these things. Thank you.
Yeah. And lastly, Amanda, do you have any memories of your time with Sasha that you'd like to share?
Yes, I have very long, lovely memories of Sasha and Ann together. And I always thought they were just...
I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you, Amanda. Is everyone, am I alone in that?
No.
Yeah, her volume's really low.
Well, I first came across Ann and Sasha when I'd first decided the psychedelics were my life's passion and what I was going to spend my life investigating and bringing to our culture. And so it was 30 years later when I saw a little pamphlet in some boat in Amsterdam about a conference called Ushmal, where there were a kind of gang of US psychedelic experts. So I thought, well, really, maybe we should go there, me and Jamie, my partner, we should go and investigate what the American psychedelic experts were like. So we went to Ushmal and immediately fell in love with Ann and Sasha. And how wonderful they were. And he gave his extremely funny lectures, which often started with some kind of adrenaline-making announcement of how the CIA were just outside, or something like that, and getting everyone's attention buzzing. And they were just utterly lovable as a pair. And it was a kind of delight that the psychedelic world should have such a rare and brilliant and delightful couple as the kind of godparents of the movement. And we had lots of fun at Uxmal, and then they were much wilder than the current conferences and in the jungle. And then there was several we went to at Palenque, which were pure delight. And always Sasha was just wonderful. And then later, I can't remember what the dates were, but then we went to several sessions at Burning Man. We camped with them. And it was just a constant delight and surprise. And it was lovely driving around with Sasha. He was given a kind of buggy to move around. And the worshippers kind of, he was so modest in his crown, the emperor of the Burning Man. And Gertie's coming, kissing his feet, and being so excited about it. And it was just always a pure delight to be with him and Anne. They were such a kind of inspiring couple together. And he was always so encouraging, and so was Anne in the work I was doing, trying to get psychedelics back into rehabilitation, and which is a long 50-year-old struggle. But they were very part of the nicest part of the whole psychedelic. I can't say how much I adore meeting them. And I always wished we were neighbors, just down the road. Have fun, good talk. And wonderful Anne. You were so beautiful actress, celebrating Sasha's life.
And Amanda, the microphone seems very quiet on you. I could hear it, but I think it's probably right around the limit of what people can hear. So I just want to make sure that anything you can do to, because I don't want people to miss your responses.
Right. Sorry, I'll try to speak up more. But yeah, I just think they're a unique couple. He's a classical hero, shot with a lot of humor and a love of cheap red wine. Just, he made so many people, including us, incredibly happy. And his inspiration in talking about chemistry, and I remember quite often going to the farm and him showing me and Cosmo all the talk about the chemistry. And then he and Anne came and spent his 80th birthday at Beckley. And just, it's been a lovely friendship, and I send them my love and respect. And this book is wonderful. It catches his brilliance and his eccentricity and his uniqueness. And I think we were very lucky. And then we once went to see Albert Hoffman together in his house. And that was a kind of double treat. I just remember a time that Anne and Sasha was just pure enjoyment. Thank you for being the inspiration. You have been.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have the opportunity to know him for as long as most of the people on this panel, but I remember very vividly the first time that I learned about Alexander Shulgin. He'd been profiled in the New York Times Magazine, and I remember reading the profile and being so amazed that not only that someone like that existed, but that someone like that even could exist. It almost seemed impossible to me that there could be such a man. And I immediately read peak hall, and it seemed impossibly amazing. It was beyond anything that I'd ever seen. And I immediately reached out to him. I was a freshman at UChicago. I had absolutely nothing to offer him. I'm sure whatever message I sent him was embarrassing and stupid. And he responded thoughtfully and with courtesy and invited me into his life and into his home. And I will always remember that about him, because anytime I get a message from somebody and I think I'm too busy to respond to this message, or I don't know about that, I remember the kindness that Sasha showed everyone, not just people that could benefit him in some way, but absolutely everyone, and how he built such a beautiful life with that courtesy and openness. And I think it's really a lesson that we can all benefit from. So I think that I've covered all of the panelists there, and I wanted to move on to the next subject, which is an enormous one, and very well may take up the rest of this discussion. But we are at an extraordinary moment in the history of psychedelics. It's a moment that I don't think any of us could have anticipated. Maybe Rick, I don't know. I certainly didn't anticipate it would arrive so soon. And there are amazing changes taking place in the drug policy, the science, the commercialization of psychedelics. I remember when I was working on my projects in the past, it used to be very difficult to talk to people about this research because many people had legal reservations. They were afraid of some kind of legal fallout from discussing their involvement with this world. Now I find that many people don't want to talk about it because they're in the midst of attempting to patent this or that psychedelic therapy that they're working on. So it's kind of an amazing new type of secrecy that I could have never anticipated. But yeah, I'd like to just talk to you about what the current state of psychedelic research is and what your involvement is and what Sasha did to get us to this amazing place. And I guess I will begin again with John Gilmore.
Thank you, Hamilton. Well, at MAPS, our main goal for decades has been to take one of Sasha's most popular molecules, MDMA, and because we didn't believe that the political process would ever free it up for human use, legal human use, instead we went the medical route. And so we've been doing clinical trials on it. And we're currently in the middle of our second phase 3 trial, which in theory will be the last trial if it all works out before the FDA would actually decide to approve this for use as a medicine. So it took 35 years, and it took the perseverance of a Rick Doblin to bring that into existence. But Rick has inspired a huge number of people to contribute and donate, and we now have a team of 100 plus people working at MAPS and the MAPS subsidiary that are actively working on making this into a medicine. The condition that we are focused on for the first trials is post-traumatic stress disorder. We've also done trials in other things, particularly social anxiety for people on the autism spectrum. And the trials are going amazingly well. And we're looking forward to seeing legal access sometime in the next 2 to 3 years.
That's great. And Cosmo, do you have a thought on this amazing time?
Yeah, I mean, it is an incredible time, and certainly growing up around it my whole life. I like you, Hamilton, would never have predicted the pace of change. It is incredible, and I wish Sasha was here to see it, to be honest. But I mean, I think obviously some people here on this phone on this call have had such a big impact that I feel kind of I shouldn't take too much time, because there are a lot more people who have made a really, really meaningful contributions to this movement. But I think what many of those on this panel have done, and I think Sasha was the kind of the master of it was leading with science and, kind of bridging what was illicit with kind of really good quality science and leading with that. And that's the kind of legitimizing tool for this whole movement, essentially. And that's obviously now manifested itself in what John was talking about, which is developing these compounds medically as licensed pharmaceuticals. But Sasha, I suppose, was doing it from the very beginning and kind of artfully dancing the line between the legitimate and the illicit, and always with kind of extreme humility, I suppose. And so, we're obviously running a drug development company looking at psilocybin and other drugs, but one of the other things we're doing is looking at developing new chemical entities, so new psychedelic compounds. And it's kind of again, it's a funny idea because what Sasha was so many years ahead of what people are now trying to do. And if he had been given free rein and supported like people are being supported now, just imagine the impact he could have had, even beyond the impact that he has had, I suppose.
Great, thank you. And Rick, I know that you have a whole lot to say about this.
Yeah, we are in the process of trying to globalize MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. We've just started research in Europe. So just a few days ago, we treated the first person in the Czech Republic, before that in the Netherlands. We're moving forward in 9 sites in 6 countries. Our current research is in Israel, Canada, and the United States. We do anticipate completing our second phase 3 study around October of 2022. And then if it's even close to as good as our first phase 3 study, applying then to the FDA for a new drug application, which we think by the end of 2023 or before then, we should have approval. What I'll speak to now is just the other things that we're doing that are not directly on the phase 3 path, but that are designed, I would say, to educate the PTSD research community, and also designed to address the Veterans Administration and try to get it adopted there. There's over 1 million vets on disability for PTSD. And so what we're doing is there are a series of psychotherapies that have been used in the Veterans Administration and elsewhere for PTSD, among them prolonged exposure, cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, where it's couples where one has PTSD, but it affects the relationship. And then EMDR and cognitive processing therapy. So we're sponsoring research into all of those combinations. We have our own method, which we call inner-directed therapy, which basically comes from the early work that Stan and others did with LSD, where you see the psychedelic as catalyzing this incredible process of emergence into awareness of traumas, of memories, with the fear reduced from MDMA. And so we support what people are doing. We say that there's this inner healing intelligence. It's very unscripted, and a lot of our therapy training is about untraining people to be an interventionist and to impose techniques. But these other techniques are also effective to some degree. And so we're working with Edna Foa, who developed prolonged exposure, Barbara Rothbaum at Emory, Edna Foa, the project will be done in Israel, Candace Monson, who helped develop cognitive behavior conjoint therapy, where both members of the couple get MDMA. We're going to be, we already did a small treatment development study that got results better than anything before with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy without MDMA. Plus it's couples therapy. So we're sort of backing into couples therapy, which will be one of the best uses of MDMA, but it's not a medical disease. So we're not going to be able to medicalize it through the FDA, but hopefully it can be used and eventually we think covered by insurance. And we're going to be supporting this woman, Ann Wagner, in Toronto to blend MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. And we're trying to get together a study blending MDMA with EMDR in Flagstaff with Navajo Indians with PTSD, and with a Native American therapist as well. But the other big thing that we're very much looking forward to is exploring group therapy. And so that's got potential advantages for helping people support each other, and also for reducing the cost of therapy. And so that's going to be one of the main challenges, is once it's approved, are we going to be getting insurance coverage? And we've recently hired the Boston Consulting Group to do an analysis of the path to commercialization and to help us figure out pricing and what, number of therapists we're going to train, how we do that. And so the group therapy study is going to be taking place at the Portland VA. And it'll take another couple of months before we get it ready, maybe till the end of the year before that study starts. But I think group therapy is going to be one of the big developments to see how well it works. And then our therapist training, what we've realized, from the very beginning, is that the MDMA, and the same is true with psilocybin and other things, it's not a treatment in and of itself. It's a treatment combined with supportive context. And so the key to scaling this is going to be training therapists. And we have a plan to train in the first enough therapists to treat 1 million people in the first 10 years with PTSD. And when we think about what we've done with several hundred people that we've trained, that we've treated, and most of them no longer, 2/3 of them at least, no longer have PTSD, the impact that that's having on their families, on their therapists, on the community, is pretty powerful. And if you could imagine what it would be like to treat 1 million people in the first 10 years, I think that is going to be very important. And the other thing, just to add, is that we are also very supportive, as is Amanda and Cosmo and all of us here, about the need for drug policy reform. And this is where I think Sasha's leadership was so strong as well. That Sasha was very much a scientist, very much in favor of the scientific endeavor and doing the clinical research, but he also was very much in favor of people having the freedom to explore on their own in legal contexts with MDMA and other psychedelics. And so that's our sort of dual track strategy. And it's going to be very important, I think, to provide some sort of a context for people to access pure drugs with honest drug education, with harm reduction, with treatment on demand. We anticipate thousands and thousands of psychedelic clinics that will be set up starting in 2020. Well, there's already about 300 or so ketamine clinics. A lot of the ketamine therapists are interested in being cross-trained with MDMA, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT, and other substances. So it's really about the birth of psychedelic psychotherapy. So even though we have to study individual drugs and get them approved by the FDA, in practice, we think that the psychedelic therapists will customize and personalize the treatment to this specific patient. And they'll go through a sequence that may be of different drugs that'll be different for everybody, uniquely customized. And we anticipate by the end of 2028 or so to have trained around 24,000 therapists. And so that's our goal. Right now we're experimenting because of COVID. We've turned our training online. So we have 300 people now going through the training program. There's 2 parts that's not included. And I think one of the things that's really important to say, the one part is supervision. We want to supervise people as they work with their first PTSD patient, to give them feedback on whether they're, it's called adherence rating, whether they're adhering to the therapeutic method that we've developed calling inner-directed therapy, which treatment manual is on our website also for anybody that wants to see what the method is. But the other thing, and I think this is where, again, Sasha led the way, is that he experimented with himself. We believe that therapists who want to do this sort of work would be more effective if they've taken the drugs that they're giving to their own patients. Now, you don't say that therapists should get electroconvulsive therapy to give ECT to their patients, or they don't necessarily need to take antipsychotics or anything like that, but it's not about trying to develop a therapeutic alliance with those treatments. And it's not about the intervention of the therapist. So I think that this idea of providing a context for therapists to have their own experience is really important. And again, Sasha led the way in his own self-experimentation. So that's just a brief overview of where we're at. And we think that by 2035, after a decade and 5,000 or 6,000 of these psychedelic clinics, the culture will have finally wised up and we'll have some sort of licensed legalization for people to access this on their own.
That's great. Thank you. And I wanted to just add a tiny bit to this question. I should have said this at the beginning, but I think one of the things that worries me most in this very rapid transformation is division within the psychedelic community and infighting, disagreement, corporate interests versus the underground versus patients. And I know that Leonard Pickard, you have an amazing insight into this world, having been involved on an academic level, an underground level, and now in a pharmaceutical capacity as well, and that you've been keeping very close tabs on the pharmaceutical development of these substances. So what is your take on both the current state of things and how we can ensure the smoothest transition into the future?
Well, thank you, Hamilton. Let me transition from what Rick just said concerning the need for therapists to have personal experience of these particularly potent compounds. To me, it's unthinkable that a therapist would attempt to treat a patient undergoing these particular substances without traveling that long night of the soul, if you will, themselves. There needs to be an empathic connection. There needs to be an understanding of the magnitude of the experience, the depth of the experience, the course of the experience. As Rick mentioned, it's not like taking an antibiotic or undergoing some other procedure. It's a spiritual journey in which one needs a holding hand of someone that understands where one is going to and how to return to the blessed natural mind afterwards. But returning to what Sasha would think about the current state of affairs, he would no doubt be extremely delighted. I'm sure he would sit on a number of advisory boards or perhaps in his own rogue way remain independent of it all. I recall he mentioning that NASA once approached him to please sign over all of his analogs to them and not publish or go public with it, which he refused to do so. How would Sasha think about the current matter? It's certainly a surprise to me. During 20 years of rather serious isolation at the sharp spear point of government might, and very little information coming in about the transformations going on socially. Occasional article in the New York Times, I might see an email from a friend. But until last summer, I had no idea of the breadth and magnitude of the global transformation that is occurring. It is truly an unanticipated, certainly in my life, and most remarkable time of great promise, and a path which we must all walk very carefully. Currently we're in the euphoriant stage. There may be plateauing in the next 3 or 4 years as corporations tend to shake out depending upon clinical trials outcomes. We may be in for a few media-worthy events from, say, loosely vetted patients being treated in clinical trials abroad. What would Sasha do about all this? He thought about future drugs a lot. In the early 70s, he published a paper called Future Drugs, in which he anticipated what the next 30 years would be like in pharmacology. And he tried to predict classes of drugs that would achieve social concerns or be unusually transformative, or new classes of psychedelics, opiates, anesthetics, stimulants. And he was wise in this particular paper. He did put in a line or two predicting that fentanyl and its analogs would rear its beastly head down the road because of the ease of synthesis and the ease of acquisition of precursors and the carelessness of clandestine chemists who cared not about the outcomes among people. Sasha did care greatly about the outcomes of his particular phenethylamines and fretted enormously of any negative reports in the media. But at the same time, in memories of Sasha, one of Sasha's own favorite anecdotes, speaking of analogs, is the president of Aldrich Chemical, a giant Chicago firm with thousands of chemists, known as the chemist, once visited the compound with Sasha and Ann. And Sasha had been sending for some years a few hundred milligrams of his elegant productions for Aldrich to list in their fine chemical catalogs, the only place in the world that you could get these substances. And the president of Aldrich, after touring Sasha's lab, said, you know, Aldrich, with thousands of chemists, is not as productive as this humble, small laboratory with Sasha Shulgin in command, with his bright mind and his bright heart and the elegance of his methodology. It was a tremendous accolade. And in terms of what Sasha would think about the current matter, he would probably fret greatly about the division that's occurring with the arguments over patenting. For example, Compas's need to patent psilocybin and sorting polymorphs, and the many other firms that have patent applications in play, and the large American subset of people that feel that this is an improper path and one should not patent natural compounds or particularly healing compounds. It lessens their availability. I think Sasha would lean slightly toward the patenting because he did a number of patents at Dow, which helped him out in his later years. So he understood the need for corporatization. But I think he would encourage those that are patenting not to attempt to enforce the patents necessarily, and to let multiple uses and multiple types of production occur simultaneously to see what the outcomes are. Since this is all so new for all of us, we can't see clearly the direction we're headed in. So it's very important that we consistently speak with each other, that we tolerate each other's particular value systems and the diverse methodologies, and that we guide this stunning evolutionary transformation in pharmacology with the wisdoms that we may have acquired over our lifetimes.
That's great. Thank you. And Paul, do you have any thoughts on the current state of psychedelic research and how Sasha would feel about it, and advice on how we can ensure that this transition is as smooth as possible?
Well, yeah, to kind of continue on some of Leonard's comments, I think there is great promise for expanded use in therapy, and the path is now pretty well mapped out by MAPS and their effort, and Hefter Institute and their effort with psilocybin. I guess one of my concerns going forward is how to open up the door for sort of a paradigm shift into dealing with the problem of how to create access to psychedelics for people who are not trying to treat a disease or apply them to a particular medical indication. I think probably everyone in the audience has explored these things to one degree or another for want of a better term, psychospiritual exploration. try to understand ourselves, to understand how we are placed on the planet, what we can do to foster and protect the place where we live. And psychedelics can have a very profound impact on that mode of thinking. But right now, the FDA process is focused really on efficacy in treating indications. And I think at some point we need to open up a discussion about safety and education. Certainly there are psychedelics that are hazardous. There are not very many, but there are some that have known toxicities that can creep in. And in a world where probably the lion's share of people acquiring psychedelics get a bag of white powder, it's very difficult to have a confidence in the quality control of how experiences are delivered. So I would love to see, along with expanded medical formal therapeutic research, some means by which the production and distribution of psychedelics can be managed with another model.
And Paul, your camera went out, just so you know.
Thank you.
If there's nothing you can do, don't worry about it.
I can fix that in a moment.
Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe just finish what you were saying. Didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. In the meantime, the model that I like to come back to is Aldous Huxley's Island. Probably not as well read as Brave New World, but I think much more thoughtful about the role of psychedelics in society and how particularly young people might be introduced to psychedelics. So that's a work that I think we need to revisit and think about as we move forward.
Great. And Nick, do you have any thoughts on the current state of research, what Sasha would think, and how we can smooth this transition?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that most of the research is to treat psychiatric conditions. I think that is just the tip of the iceberg. So when we talk about medical models, it's typically psychiatric things such as depression, anxiety, and so forth. But there are a number of other physiological targets that psychedelics can affect. And here I'm thinking things like neurological diseases, stroke, ischemia, inflammation, allergy, and so on. There was a company, I think it was about 5 days ago, that was just issued a provisional patent for the use of DMT in stroke. So there are people who are looking at this, but very few. From my knowledge, most of the companies are looking at these psychiatric conditions or trying to patent set and setting like Compass is trying to do. And it also seems that most of the focus is on a smallish set of molecules. There are companies that are creating new compounds for investigation. Of course, there's a long path between synthesizing a new compound and having it be available to humans. But nevertheless, there's a lot of interesting science that can occur along the way, both in terms of chemistry and pharmacology, preclinical pharmacology, and so on. And I think that, one thing about, I think Sasha was interested, he was a medicinal chemist. He was interested in structure-activity relationships. And I think he would appreciate investigating new compounds and would, support that kind of direction. So in terms of regulation, I just want to touch on it. I saw a couple things in the chat and so on. And, if we talk about a medical model, then, then the FDA is there to kind of have I guess, guardrails and direction on how to bring a compound about. But I think there are ways to study these that don't necessarily go through the FDA in terms of tools for neuroscience, understanding brain chemistry, and so on, that don't necessarily have to traverse that route. And one thing I just want to share with you is, several decades ago, when I was interested in this area, and the DEA would come up, and you had to get the DEA. They put the kibosh on MDMA research and so on, and I had to disabuse myself of the notion that the DEA's role was to evaluate work in terms of scientific merit. The DEA's role is to issue licenses, as far as I'm concerned, and whether a project has scientific merit or not is determined by scientists, not kind of regulators. And so that kind of gave me some encouragement that I could be transparent. And I saw other people's work too, like Dave Nickolas' work, Sasha's work, where they were kind of out front about it and transparent, but it was in the service of science. And so I kind of just throwing some things into the mix here, but in terms of regulation, I think the DEA has become more, amenable to, permitting the research, if you like, in the form of issuing licenses. So that's just something that I think if something stands on a good scientific foundation, then I think the work can proceed.
Great. And Amanda, and just again, I want to make sure that you're speaking as loudly as possible and that your microphone, because I don't want anyone to miss what you're saying. I know that you're doing an enormous amount of work in this area and that you have been very involved in this for a long time. What are your thoughts on the current state of psychedelic research? Sasha's thoughts on it, if you were here to observe it, and how we can smooth this transition and make sure that it's as graceful as possible.
I think it's an amazingly exciting time. And in a way, I'm not surprised that it's come so quickly. I always thought it's very, very slow pushing the rock up the cliff, but suddenly it will catch light. And with the internet, it can spread very, very quickly and change very quickly. And that's just what it's done over the last 2 or 3 years. It's completely changed the environment. And I think wonderfully, it's much more possible. It's quicker to get approvals, to do research. I personally love doing exploratory research in many fields. I mean, I've got a lot of particular loves. I love LSD, and I think it's very, because of the taboo, the misplaced taboo. I'm doing many studies with LSD, both in full dose, but also in microdose. And now I'm just, we did a test on dose and efficacy, and the microdose showed amazing advantage in mood, cognition, and pain management. And that just seems to fit perfectly into palliative care. At the moment I'm setting up 2 studies with the first ones, I think, to do palliative care. One with natural psilocybin, which we're making in a bioreactor, and natural, and the other with LSD in the US. And I just seen some amazing, this 97-year-old woman who's in dementia and in a very bad way, and how a very small microdose brought her fully back to life and in engagement with her son, and saying how wonderful she felt. Could she read her poetry now? And I think there's so much which we haven't explored. I think we're at the foothills of the exploration. And I think, as I was saying, that it's neurodegenerative illnesses. We've kind of cracked the nut with psychological illnesses and showing how a full dose of a psychedelic can increase neuroplasticity and change the setting in the brain much more easily with good therapeutic guidance or help, support. And so that's an amazing thing as we enter this pandemic of mental illness, that we've got a new treatment to tackle it with. And I think that it will provide a paradigm shift, the use of psychedelics. But I think there are many other areas where these psychedelics can bring a paradigm shift for rather suffering humanity at the moment. One in neurodegenerative illnesses. I'm doing quite a lot of work in that in translational study. You do with mini brains and then with animals and humans, and showing how amazing these compounds can be, for instance, in increasing neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, anti-inflammation, all things which underlie so many conditions, particularly neurodegenerative conditions like Parkinson. I'm doing a very exciting study with Parkinson, microdosing, actually, Ibogaine. And we're doing a survey at the moment, which is showing very positive results. And then Alzheimer's. There's all sorts of new areas we can explore. So I think it's just opening up. And obviously the good, I realized in the early 70s when the cloud of the war on drugs came down, closing everything, the dark kind of cloud of prohibition and taboo. And I realized that really the only way through that was with the very best science, because science is the modern religion, and only by demonstrating the benefits of these compounds with the best research would we be able to dissolve the taboo, which is blocking humanity from using these compounds, which traditionally has been called the flesh of the gods or gifts of the gods. And so I think that is beginning to happen now. And then we need desperately to break the barricade of the misplaced prohibitions. I mean, I've been presenting at the UN for many, many years. And I think finally maybe they're getting, the culture generally is getting accustomed to news of how beneficial these substances are. And I think Sasha would have been delighted at this change. And, you know, it's wonderful to have more people involved, but we have to bring about the changes in regulation. We need to decriminalize all psychoactive compounds. It's insane to have them criminalized. And then we need to rapidly reschedule psychedelics, particularly beginning with psilocybin, but I think it would be better if you just recognize the immense medical potential of the psychedelics and lowered their schedule from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, so doctors can prescribe them and it's much more easy to do the research. But I think we're on the right path, and I don't think it can be turned back now. I think it's got too far to be turned back. And yeah, I think Sasha would be delighted. I mean, it's just such a pity he's not there here and bathing the whole thing in his high sense of wit and fun and joyousness. But I think we can move faster than we have before. And there's obviously now the input of investment money, which in some ways makes organizations like mine and RICS more difficult to raise funding because there's an alternative for philanthropy, which is a bottomless well in the sense that people think the for-profit model. but it does bring much extra capitalization into, so things can move much quicker, which is very good news. And obviously, as mentioned, the next major problem is how to provide access to people who can benefit from these compounds. And we need to, I totally agree with all Rick said, we need to open up the training of psychedelic therapy and also places where people can get access. I mean, we're starting a clinic in Barcelona, which will, I think it's rather unique thing is that it will be a clinic to treat, but it will also be a research center. So that will widen the compounds one can use, but it will also enable a more personalized approach to treatment, which I think in the long run will be a benefit, because individual people will respond better with different combinations and different compounds and different therapeutic models. And that will be easier to work out in the clinic research center. But I think it's all going in a wonderfully positive direction. I mean, obviously there are problems, and it's how does one keep the ethical integrity of the psychedelics, which are in a way not only God-given, but what is so wonderful is that the center of the healing capacity is a correlation with the mystical experience. So it's rather, in a sense, humorous, one can say, that in a way, science killed off the spiritual. And now, at the very breaking edge of the science, is coming the realization that at the core of the healing is the mystical experience, which correlates better with a high success rate. And that's rather beautiful. But there's just so much for us to explore. I'm very fascinated in further study into the mechanisms underlying the different changes from the different compounds, and how they work with changes in cerebral circulation, changes in neural activity, trying to get a better picture of how all that adds up. And so we can learn more about the mechanisms underlying it, so we can learn better to use these as tools to the benefit of humanity, which is going through a little bit of a pandemic of mental illness and rather having lost its soul. And so I think we're at the foothills of great new breakthroughs, and the slow acceptance of the majesty and special qualities of these compounds into the social fabric. And that's what I decided I wanted to do in 1966. I realized that society needed to have these compounds reintegrated into its fabric. So those who needed them, either to cure illness or to increase spirituality or creativity or fun of life or all the other things that they can be used for, can access them in a safe and educated way. And it's lovely that society is beginning to move in that direction. And I think the taboo is being broken down with the good science, which is coming through from all different angles and all building up into a more and more clearly defined cobweb of just how wonderful these compounds are and how grateful we should be to be able to research them and introduce them into society. And I think the whole regulatory system is loosening, but we need so far not one word of the conventions, which are completely misplaced and have caused unimaginable suffering worldwide and hold up progress for 50 years. We really need to rewrite the UN conventions so that individual countries can do what they think is best for their citizens and free the whole thing up. And well, I think we're at a very exciting stage. And I'm so delighted we've got Anne still with us, and I wish we had Sasha, but we've got his memory and all the wonderful lessons he taught us all. So I think it's a time to rejoice.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. And with only about 10 minutes left, I'd love to ask all of the panelists very quickly about, this is the question that I think I'm asked the most. You have so many people on the sidelines who value psychedelics, who recognize their potential. They want to be involved, but they don't know how, they don't know what they can do, but they want to be a part of this world. I remember asking the very same question myself when I was first getting involved. I asked Andrew Sewell before he died, I asked Julie Holland. Everyone gave me a different answer. And of course, there isn't one answer, but based on your experience, what do you think a young person who values this can do to contribute and to be a part of this world? And I'll start again with John.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think the main, I don't know. I think that, as we were saying, that people having personal experience with these substances is a necessity if they're going to actually treat other people with them. So, you know, I hesitate to recommend that people break the law, but nevertheless, it seems to be the most popular way to discover what these substances are good for. I also wanted to say there are efforts in a variety of states, in the United States at least, where we have found a way through the political process to reduce the restrictions and to make valid ways that people can have psychedelic treatments and experiences without having to be diagnosed and go through the medical system. Tom Eckert and the late Sherry Eckert in Oregon teamed up with David Bronner and Graham Boyd to pass the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative. And the success of that initiative has led to interest in 5 or 10 other states where people can actively work on having their own state legalize the use of one or more psychedelics for not just medical uses, but also for personal growth and relationship issues and all the other things that we know these drugs are good for. So I think that's all I need to say on that.
Okay, and Cosmo?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a good, I mean, firstly, obviously the easiest thing for everyone to do, which I hope they can do, is support charities that are doing amazing work like MAPS and the Beckley Foundation and Uzona and others. So that's something that everyone can and should do. But then I think if you want to be kind of more actively involved, I'd say never has there been more opportunity to be actively involved in this space in a legitimate way. And, you know, obviously we've talked mainly about the R&D and the science, and that's, you know, you obviously have to have a fairly kind of narrowly focused speciality in science to help with that. But, you know, there is so much that is evolving around this space at the moment, and so many opportunities. And like John was just mentioned, there's the drug policy side, there's growing, you know, exciting things around tech, around wellness, there are so many different opportunities now. So really, if you want to do something in this space, now is a better time than there has ever been in the history of time. So jump at it, I would say.
I agree. And Rick, what are your thoughts about how to get involved in this?
Well, you know, if we look at other social change movements that have succeeded, particularly gay rights and gay marriage, and of course they still have ways to go, but they succeeded from people coming out and speaking about who they were and being proud of that and being willing to entertain criticism for that from some circles. And so in general, people respond more to stories than they do to data. You know, we have to generate data for FDA and that will be effective. And when FDA says yes, that will influence a whole lot of people. But I think that young people particularly should be thinking about what we need most is therapists. So if they're interested in a career in becoming a psychedelic psychotherapist, I strongly encourage that. But also what people can do individually is just learn as much as you can, get educated as much as you can, and then speak to others about what you've learned. And if you do have your own experiences and you're comfortable speaking about them, that would be very important to do. The other thing is for people to register to vote, because what we're going to be seeing is that there are going to be a lot more drug policy initiatives on the ballot in multiple states. There is effort to restrict the initiative process in a lot of places, but I don't know that that will succeed everywhere. I don't think it will. So I think people tend to dismiss the role that voting plays because, millions of people and I'm just one person, but I think that can be a very, very effective way. If all these people that are wondering about what their impact would be, if they all register to vote, particularly young people, it would have a dramatic effect. So again, educate yourself to the extent that you feel comfortable, have your own experiences, but I'd say do them in a safe way with a sitter or at least somebody part of the group that's watching over everybody. And try to take courage in speaking out. We are trying to develop Team Psychedelic and with monthly donors. And so we've got 12 or 1,300. We'd like to get up to 10,000. So I'd like to encourage people to think about that. And there's all sorts of other ways that people can contribute if they're not interested in becoming a therapist. There's going to be need to business people to run clinics or massage therapists or others that will be associated at these clinic settings. But if people have psychedelic sensibilities, then that will be really helpful. So I guess the main thing to say is that everybody can make a difference. Martin Luther King said, everybody can be great because everybody can serve. And so I think in this movement of trying to help consciousness prevail, we need everybody to do their part, and particularly young people. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to make a contribution.
And Leonard, what thoughts do you have about what people can do to become involved in this world and promote psychedelic research?
Well, Hamilton, I certainly wouldn't advise anyone to freely distribute hundreds of millions of doses, but the underground has always been with us and will continue during the medicalization, corporatization effort. I'm not sure that if any researchers are looking at the magnitude of that. But what Sasha probably would say, and certainly said to me when I inquired as to what could one do at all levels, he remarked, as Rick so thoughtfully mentioned, that it depends upon one's talents and attributes and focus. So one young woman might be an MD, another might be a therapist, a body worker, a spiritual guide. Simply having the heart of compassion, not saying you must take this drug, but you must behave in a loving manner to others in our precious world. That's the essential teaching of these substances. In terms of actually being involved with a compound, Sasha would sum it up for those that had talent in chemistry, for example, as get that PhD, get that doctorate. I know Hamilton's going back to school and is following that advice. Sasha would just simply encourage everyone to follow their heart and their clear mind. And insofar as the drugs may be helpful or insightful, so be it. I think he would approve of not only treatment centers, but retreats where one simply explores spiritual values without having any type of emotional difficulty that clinically presents. And I think that young people might encourage that, not to be afraid to be politically active. Don't be afraid to talk to anyone at any level of society, particularly young people. The old ones, those in power, welcome your insight and your enthusiasm. So young people, go forward with your bright minds. Sasha would love that.
Thank you. And Paul, what are your thoughts? We're quickly running out of time, so I don't want anyone to get cut off, but how people can promote this research.
Well, again, I think one thing, this is maybe a little off topic, but Sasha looked at his creations as tools for exploring the mind and the brain. I think there's a lot of value of using the diverse palette of materials that he created to help us better understand how our brains work. Now that we have very exotic tools like the functional MRI and all the various scanning methodologies that have come out, we could really, I think, learn a lot more about how our brains operate since we have unprecedented tools. Some of these compounds produce a psychedelic emotional state with no visuals. Some are predominantly visual or even auditory without the emotional component. We have no idea how all of that manifests itself in terms of localized activity in the brain. So there's a lot of room for work. And I'll just reiterate what Leonard just said. Sasha over and over said, get those degrees. Not everyone necessarily needs a PhD, but get your bachelor's, get your master's. You have much more credibility in the greater world if you've shown that you can put up with the process. Be perfectly honest. And the PhD is sort of the culmination of that. It really opens doors because people give you the license. It's the union card for being able to make decisions in how science is done. So education first, communication a close second, and heart and love of your fellows a close third. So win, place, show. There you go.
Great, thank you. And Nick, what are your thoughts on how to promote this research and get involved?
Yeah, I regularly am contacted by students asking exactly this question, and my response usually is to point out that there are sort of two general paths. The clinical path for people who like working with patients, helping with therapy, and I point out that typically an MD or an RN or that type of degree is suitable, and encourage them to do that. A graduate degree really is almost a must to ask your own questions and write your own research. And then the second path is kind of a basic science path for people who are interested in chemistry, pharmacology, neuroscience. And I encourage them to go to graduate school, get a PhD or even an MD PhD, and again, to write their own research, ask their own questions. And so I'm kind of reiterating what Leonard said and also what Paul said. I think education is paramount, and it's really going through the process. I'm reminded of the alchemists, distilling, redistilling, redistilling, redistilling. It's the process of going through there that I think where knowledge and experience come from. And just I want to point out a couple of things. The University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Pharmacy is instituting a new, I guess first in the nation, master's program specifically focused on psychoactive drugs with a heavy emphasis on psychedelics. So this is UW-Madison School of Pharmacy. And then Rick mentioned earlier about coming out. And I would point out that Dr. Richard Lewis Miller is in the process of writing a book called Confessions of Psychedelic Elders, in which he is interviewing people for his broadcast show who are, I guess, typically over 65, professionals, lawyers, doctors, et cetera, people who lived a full life, and getting their stories on their experiences with psychedelics. And so I think that's also important for people who are respected to come out and tell their story, encourage other people who are younger to go down this path. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And lastly, Amanda, what are your thoughts on how people can be involved in this world and promote this research?
I think there's an enormous possibility for anyone. And although I'm sure PhDs are very useful thing, I'd just like to say that I left school at 16, but dedicated myself to the cause of expanding consciousness and learning about it and how to educate the world about it so it becomes part of our culture and just built into the social fabric. And I think, you know, young people, there's so many different ways they can lend their weight. I mean, the basic theme is know thyself. And these compounds can immensely enhance one's potential to gain self-knowledge. And we want to celebrate the fact that we know more and more about them, and we should learn how to use them in safer ways and expand it. And so it's all a question. What psychedelics do is actually expand connectivity in every sense between the nerve cells, blood cognition, between people, between the whole way. It's an increasing connectivity. And it's wonderful if young people learn about it, become therapists, or do this or do that, and communicate about how it can be used beneficially from they've seen experience. I mean, it would be wonderful when we, as a species, improve the condition of dying through wonderful end-of-life research, but then also through palliative care and giving these poor old people shut up in horrible homes the ability of expanding their cognition again. You know, I think we're at a very exciting turning point, and we want all the young people who want to get involved, because there's plenty of room for their expression and the value of their work to bring about a change. And I'm sure that's what Sasha always thought. You know, get you know, lend your weight to changing the world to be a better and happier place.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I knew that we would have no difficulty filling this 2 hours, and it seems we've gone a bit over, but I think that's okay. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and I recommend anyone listening to this pick up a copy of The Nature of Drugs. It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful opportunity to experience Sasha's teaching, and I think everyone will enjoy it, and I look forward to the future.